Okay, we're going to continue our discussion here of business ethics as well as social responsibility. We left off last going over some of the different ways we can gather relevant information, some of the questions and things that we can ask. Obviously dealing with utility, does it benefit everyone? Rights, is it something that respects the rights of everyone? Justice, is this situation or is this action fair? And then caring, lastly, is it consistent with people's responsibilities to one another? Here we're going to go over a couple different things that are a couple different ways, I should say, that companies encourage ethical behavior in their particular businesses. And obviously it's very important for companies to encourage these types of things. We've all seen the potential consequences or the consequences of what happens when employees behave in an unethical way. So not only does doing these things kind of lay the framework or the groundwork, so to speak, so that employees have knowledge of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable behavior, but it also serves as a way for employers to kind of cover their bases, so that if they're in a situation to where they have to reprimand or terminate a particular employee, they can say that, well, we've actually gone ahead and we've instituted this program. We've been very upfront with them. They signed this document stating that they were aware of our ethical policies and what is considered to be acceptable and not. So in a sense, we have grounds for termination here. It's also used as a way of preventing any type of liability from being on an employer. If they can prove that they took steps and extra steps to make sure that employees were aware of what is considered to be okay and not okay, then they may be able to pass along liability to those particular employees if they acted in a way that's outside of what they were supposed to do. So those are some of the reasons why companies obviously want to promote ethical behavior in varying degrees. So some of the things that they do here, and if you've worked for any type of company for any length of time, you're probably very familiar with some of these things. The first of which is adopting what's known as a written code of ethics. It's essentially a formal document that states what is acceptable behavior. A lot of times this will include things like the golden rule, treat everyone the way that you would want to be treated, so to speak. But it basically outlines what is acceptable and unacceptable behavior, provides that baseline for what can we do in the workplace. Like I mentioned before, these things are used for termination purposes, because you can document what is okay, what the employer or what the employee essentially understands of their position and what is okay in terms of their behavior, and then you can compare that to what ultimately their behavior was. If you have in your code of conduct that any type of stealing whatsoever is not acceptable, and that employee steals, then obviously you have grounds for termination. It's not anything that should surprise the employee because they read it first. Usually you require some type of signature or some type of confirmation stating that, yes, I agree, I've read this particular document and I will follow everything, yada, 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 so on and so forth. So it is kind of a check and balance measure as well. Another thing that is important with regards to encouraging ethical behavior is having top management support. This is probably one of the most important things. I've always said before that we tend to hold important what is important to our managers or our supervisors, whatever that may be. We will emphasize the things that are important to them because we want to be successful. And something that is a priority for your supervisor tends to be a priority for you, particularly if you have aspirations of moving up and all those sorts of things, or maybe trying to get on your employer's good side for that annual review. But if something isn't important to management, supervisor, whomever, it's not going to be important to you. So it's really important that if a company wants to instill strong ethical standards among its employees, that they actually practice what they're preaching, so to speak. Because if employees view there to be a disconnect between ultimately what the manager is saying and what they are doing, they're going to follow actions, right? Actions speak louder than words. So although I may say something and do something else, then that's truly what's going to matter. And we've all seen companies, most notably Enron, where top management did not support ethical standards, and you saw a trickle-down effect, and you'd have more of the rank-and-file employees, more of even the traders that would not engage in ethical practices because they knew that their managers didn't care. They knew that they were concerned with profits and making money, and so they would go to extra lengths to make that happen ultimately. One of the things that companies also do is institute kind of a formal ethics program. This typically can take the place of formal training or take the form of formal training. Some companies call it Ethics U for Ethics University, and it can be a formal classroom type training that basically puts employees or potential employees through real life scenarios that they may encounter. A lot of times this takes a place of pre-recorded videos. I've been through a couple of different ethics programs over the years, and I know one specifically involved actors that recorded certain scenarios in advance, and they're typically very cheesy and everybody kind of pokes fun at them because obviously they're not super high quality or anything. You want to stay within a budget. But they present you with real life scenarios, and once the scenario plays out, you typically will have some type of group discussion regarding, is the behavior okay? If it is, why? If it isn't, why not? Could this be something that you would have to bring up to a supervisor? So ethics programs, although they are a little more expensive, are becoming more popular, especially as the consequences of unethical behavior becomes very popularized, becomes very prevalent in the media of what can happen when you don't engage in ethical behavior. So companies are beginning and continuing to offer these types of programs as a way of instilling at least some type of consistent baseline ethical framework for employees to carry out their normal days with. And lastly, ethical hotlines. These are very important and allow people the ability to report unethical behavior and activities. A lot of times you may not feel comfortable going to a supervisor, especially if your supervisor is the one that's actually engaging in the unethical behavior. But people generally, we don't like to tell on people, right? There's a negative connotation with being the snitch or the tattletale or whatever you want to call it. So a lot of times we feel like we don't want to be that person, so to speak. So having an ethical hotline allows employees or managers, for that matter, to report potential unethical behavior and activities anonymously, without fear of any type of retribution, so that they can report that. Because ultimately the company wants to know, at least they should want to know, so they can do something about it. The longer that it goes on, the greater the potential for more harmful effects and fallout to occur as time progresses. All right, social responsibility. Social responsibility is a very important topic. What it basically refers to is how a business balances all of its commitments. Businesses have commitments to a lot of different groups. You have employees, you have suppliers, you have customers, you have investors. So social responsibility entails, how do you determine how to act to certain groups, because what benefits one group can be at the detriment of another. Those particular groups that a company or a business is concerned with are what are called organizational stakeholders. And these are the individuals, or groups for that matter, that are directly affected by an organization. They have a stake in their performance. If the organization does well, that has an impact on them. If an organization does poorly, that has an impact on them as well. Now there are several different types of stakeholders. First of which is we have customers. Customers obviously are the people that purchase our various products and services. Customers are very, very important, because if you don't treat them fairly, they are probably not going to stick around. The great thing about competition is that we have a multitude of different opportunities. If, say, we have a bad experience at a retailer like Target, we know that we can go to a different retailer ultimately and get those same products and services, maybe not identical, but very, very similar, right? If you were to go to a Walmart, they compete in the same industry, sell relatively the same goods and services, so you have different options. So it's important that businesses treat their customers fairly, treat them with fairness, but also honestly as well. You have to be honest in any type of environment if you're going to continue to be successful, particularly in a business context. We also have employees. It's important that we treat our employees fairly as well. Obviously paying them fair wages, treating them fairly in the workplace, treating them with respect, right? Everyone is a person, everyone has value. So maybe looking at your employees not necessarily as things to be managed, but to look at them as assets, things that really allow you to be successful. And a lot of the great things that have been accomplished throughout American history have been built on the backs of American workers. So they do have value. They do have things to contribute, and it's important to keep that in mind when dealing with them. Next, investors. Investors are very important, right? Investors are who we actually get the money from as businesses. So our responsibility to investors entails following proper accounting procedures, right? It's important that if something is truly going to be an expense, that you document it as an expense. Providing accurate financial information is very important. Investors use financial statements like balance sheets, statement of cash flows, and income statements as a way of making decisions on whether or not they want to put money into your company. And if they're basing that decision off of inaccurate information that a company provided, then their decision is not going to be very accurate, if you see what I'm saying here. So it's important that companies are responsible to investors, providing them with accurate information, properly documenting what they're doing in terms of accounting procedures, but also protecting their investments, right? Managers' primary responsibility is to ensure the value of their investors, to act in the best interests of their investors, which a lot of times is very difficult to do. But obviously, if you're not being very responsible with financial resources, then that has an impact on investors, who a lot of their income is derived from how a company performs. And if money is being used for, private vacations and purchasing homes on company money, or all these different things and different perks that are very extravagant, then that has an effect on the performance of the firm, which has an effect on ultimately what kind of revenue those investors will yield. Next, suppliers. It's important that businesses interact with suppliers not only fairly, but with the pursuit of what's called a long-term relationship. A lot of times there was this, kind of old model for the way to interact with suppliers was trying to get the goods that you need for the cheapest price and get them in the fastest way. And you would really just work for short-term gain. There was not very much of a partnership of a long-term relationship. You were more concerned about getting the things you needed quickly and cheaply. As we've seen, there's become more of a transition towards wanting to have a mutually beneficial relationship with suppliers. You're not only concerned with the price that you pay, but you're concerned about your suppliers' well-being. We want suppliers to be successful, because if they're not, then we have to go look for other ones. Starbucks has a very great model for how they interact with suppliers. They, as you know, purchase a lot of coffee beans from various areas of the world that have a climate to actually grow them successfully. And what they do is they don't necessarily just try to go to growers for the cheapest price. They want growers to be what's called sustainable, meaning that they can continue to operate their business and operate it successfully, because Starbucks views the relationship as symbiotic, so to speak. If the supplier is successful, then Starbucks can be successful. If Starbucks isn't constantly looking around for suppliers all the time, they can devote their time and energy and money to other things. So not only do they try and pay a fair price, right, less than the minimum, a fair price, but they actually put their own people in the areas where they're purchasing these coffee beans to work with the suppliers, to help them with different business-related activities, such as working on accounting, right, documenting your expenses. They create schools in those particular areas as a way of fostering economic development. So they have an interesting take, obviously, on working with suppliers, probably more aggressive, more proactive, you might say, than a lot of different companies. But it serves them very, very well, because they're not worrying about obviously getting goods from different suppliers. They're not worried about the quality of those particular goods. Obviously, if you're not getting a great deal, you may be more inclined to give one of your good customers a better batch, maybe someone who's not paying so much, maybe a lesser quality batch. So that's one way that Starbucks manages that particular relationship. And lastly, we have local and international communities. It's important that we interact, or that businesses do keep in mind local international interest when they're conducting business. This involves everything from contributing to local programs, local charities, getting involved in charities, right, and trying to minimize some of the negative impacts on communities. Some businesses, the work that they do has a harmful impact on the environment, which obviously is very, very prominent right now in people's minds when we talk about the issue of global warming and these types of things. So businesses not only need to be aware of customers, employees, investors, and suppliers and those things, but also their local communities, right? These are people that, the workers that work for these companies typically live in the community. So they want to be a part of something better. They want to feel like they're making a positive impact versus trying to earn a wage and accomplish something for someone else. All right, now there are several areas of responsibility as well that typically coincide with some of the stakeholders that we discussed earlier. You'll see some of these do overlap. The first one was companies have a responsibility toward the environment. Like I said before, there's been an increased attention on global climate change, which has resulted in a lot of pressure towards businesses to reduce the negative impact that they have on the environment in the form of pollutions and different things. So there is this trend towards reducing disposal of toxic waste. Obviously recycling is very prominent. You've had even local municipalities and city governments that have outlawed using styrofoam containers just because they take forever to literally decompose, so to speak. So these are things that are increasingly important. Controlling air, water, land pollution, very, very important as well. With the prevalence or with the prominence of basically being green, so to speak, you're starting to see more marketing. More companies are beginning to advertise their efforts to be green and to go green and about saving the environment and all those different types of things. And I agree that those things are good, but I do think that we're beginning to get towards a point to where it's more advantageous to market it than it is to actually do it. And that's an issue what's called greenwashing. It's using advertisements to project this green image, but you're not necessarily doing anything different. And the FTC attempts to crack down on companies that utilize these types of practices, obviously, but it's very difficult too because the FTC obviously is undermanned in terms of resources, so they can't necessarily bring up claims against every single company they would probably want to do so. It takes a priority, it takes a balancing effort there. All right, as we mentioned before, companies have a responsibility to their own customers, of course. Now, there are certain laws that regulate what businesses can and cannot do. It's called regulation, right? You've seen a lot of information in the press probably about how overly regulated certain areas are, and it's true that regulation does impose restrictions on businesses. Obviously, when there's regulation, that means businesses have to go to extra steps to make sure the quality of their products are fair. So that adds expenses to different things. Obviously, if you have to make concessions to the work environment and making things safer and those types of things, that costs money. And that money can't be used to reinvest in the business or to pay out to investors in the form of dividends. But regulation is not necessarily bad, right? When I get on the plane and I fly somewhere, I am very comforted in the fact that the pilot has to go through a series of steps that were mandated by the FAA. So to one extent, I am comforted by regulation. I do also understand, though, that some areas are over-regulated, and that can be a negative impact, can pose a negative impact on business as well. So as far as responsibilities to customers, obviously it's important for businesses to provide quality products, to stand behind the products that they make, right? We've all purchased things that look great on TV, right? And we purchase them, and then all of a sudden they do not work for whatever reason. Fill in the blank on whatever product experience that you've had. Businesses also need to price their products fairly. That is very, very important, that you're pricing them in such a way that you're not engaging in illegal pricing practices, which we'll go over in a few slides here momentarily. But you're seeing that there's been an increasingly transition towards this concept of what's called consumerism. And consumerism is really looking at the rights of consumers. You have different consumer advocacy groups that are kind of championing certain groups that maybe obviously have a weak following, so to speak. But when you compare these groups to businesses, obviously businesses are viewed as these, big, monopolistic beings, so to speak, that are very, very powerful, have a lot of resources, and don't necessarily need to be concerned about what the individual consumers want. Now, they do, obviously, because if they aren't, then people won't purchase their products. But you still see these popping up of different advocacy groups as a way of protecting consumers against businesses, of pioneering different legislation and things through Congress as a way of protecting consumers from businesses. There was a lot of push for protecting consumers against banks, so to speak, with regards to, credit and, obviously these different debt debt collection agencies that were engaging in, kind of unethical practices against consumers and calling them regularly and using derogatory language and things and doing really everything they had to do to collect, lying over the phone, all these different things. And so you see more legislation come out with the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act that is designed to protect consumers. So that's all as a result of these different advocacy groups, so to speak. And then you do have a basic consumer bill of rights, of course. These are things that are considered to be basic fundamental rights of consumers. And they include rights to fair products, the right to be heard, right? If you have a grievance, you should have the avenue to address that grievance. A right to be informed, to be educated about purchases, to be treated courteously, and to choose what you buy. These are things that we really take for granted now, but weren't always common as they are today. So let's go over some of the unfair practices I was going over before with regards to consumers. The first thing is unfair pricing. Obviously, businesses can engage in unfair pricing practices, and there are a few of them. First being collusion. Okay? Collusion occurs when you have two companies that agree to set a price to a certain extent. Obviously. So this obviously is wrong. We don't want companies coming together and basically agreeing to set a price a certain way. We want price to be set upon supply and demand. We want it to be based upon a company's expenses and obviously a reasonable profit, because companies should make profits, right? They need to be sustainable, but we don't feel like that should be anything extravagant. So we don't like companies coming together and agreeing to charge certain prices. There was some talk within the last several years about the airline companies doing this, that they would call each other up and say, hey, I want to increase my prices by 10% on this particular flight. I want you to do the same. And it limits our options as consumers, because if one airline does it, then maybe we can go to the next one because it's cheaper. And then that will affect the airline that went ahead and went through the price increase. But if both do it, that limits our options. So this is considered to be an unfair pricing practice. They need to be based upon merit. The next one is called price gouging. Price gouging is responding to an increase in demand for whatever reason by increasing your prices as well. And it's not just a standard increase, it's a significant increase. This typically happens when we have different events that take place. So around September 11th, for example, oil began to shoot up significantly. Now the price of oil per barrel didn't necessarily shoot up significantly, but the price that you paid at the pump went up significantly in certain areas, form of price gouging. Whenever we have natural disasters in certain areas, retailers that are engaging in unethical practices may raise the prices for certain staples like water, canned foods, those types of things that obviously don't spoil, people want to stock up on. Batteries could be another one. So that's not considered to be ethical because, once again, you're not necessarily basing it solely off of supply and demand, but you're basing it upon the fact that there is some type of event that took place that makes people that they really have no other options, so to speak. So once again, collusion and price gouging aren't considered to be fair pricing practices. On top of that, businesses can engage in unethical behavior with regards to advertising, and we've seen this very prominently. Although, as we continue to mature as a society in different things, a lot of times what we consider to be acceptable now is very different from what was considered to be acceptable 20, 30 years from now. So one, in advertising, telling the truth. Obviously being very upfront with what your product does and what it doesn't do. There are certain advertisements that may lead you to believe that you're going to have all these different benefits and things when in fact you won't. I argue that a lot of the different products and diets and things that kind of get-rich-quick schemes are unethical, right? Because they prey on people that are more weak-minded, that are turning to something that they can do really quickly. And so they're preying on those people, promising them if you do these things, then you're going to have this type of body, whatever that may be. And they typically show you an image of somebody who's in great physical shape. What they don't show you, though, is that person was like that before they started using it, right? So that is considered to be unethical, in my opinion. Next thing you have is morally objectionable advertising. Now, the FTC regulates, and the FCC, for that matter, regulates what can be advertised during certain television times. So they regulate not being able to advertise certain types of products, alcohol, tobacco, and things during children's television, right? Now, Philip Morris would probably like to do that because they want to hook them early on at a young age, but the FCC regulates whether or not they can do that. Now, this also comes into play because you consider companies like Philip Morris and these different cigarette companies and alcohol and other tobacco companies. And what if, obviously in the U.S. that isn't considered to be an ethical practice. There are laws against advertising during children's television for alcohol as well as tobacco. But in other areas of the world, it's not considered to be unlawful, right? So is that unethical, right? Is it? Maybe, maybe not. If they're held to a certain standard in one, they know it, but then they engage differently in another. It could be. All right, next we have a responsibility towards employees. Obviously, it's important to engage in fair practices. I mentioned this before briefly, but recruiting practices should not be based upon physical traits or anything. It should be more dependent upon the actual job performance indicator, so to speak. Intelligence, work performance, those types of things are very, very important. We shouldn't be discriminating in our hiring practices or promotion practices or whatever. Employers also have a responsibility to provide safe workplaces. I mentioned before that OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, does regulate to a certain extent what is considered to be safe or not safe. And increasingly you're seeing this trend towards providing opportunities for people or for employees to have a balance between work and family life, so to speak. You're seeing a lot of employees or a lot of employers offer more time off, offer different scheduling, flexible schedules so they can work at certain times, maybe be home at certain times that they need to be. You see more employers offering telecommuting where they can maybe work from home a couple days out of the week, kind of help with kind of the family responsibilities. And these are all good things. Not only do these signal that they value their employees, but it's an attraction mechanism as well. Because as a potential applicant for someone, you will view that positively, right? You would think, wow, they offer you can telecommute. That'd be great not to have to drive to the office 5 days out of the week. Not only would I save gas, but I could be home a little bit, and that would be kind of nice. So not only does it serve as an attraction mechanism, but it also serves to help maintain your employees' health. You don't want them to burn out. You don't want them to be all stressed out because that's going to affect their performance. It's important for employers to provide protection for whistleblowers as well. A whistleblower is someone who comes out publicly and basically states that there is some type of unethical behavior that's being carried out in the company, and they may have tried to address it within the company communication channels, but otherwise weren't able to, and so they are going to the media. So it's important to provide protection for these people. Now, it shouldn't be to get to the point to where you're going to the media directly, because if you're doing your job as a company, you're addressing this early on. You don't want it to get to this point, because once it gets to the media, you have less control over it, right? So you don't want it to get to this point, but it's important that even if this happens, that you provide protection for whistleblowers, because a lot of times people that reveal unethical practices or things that are going on within a company aren't the most popular people within a company, right? Most people like the status quo. They like the way that things were going, and when somebody does this kind of messes things up, so for lack of a better word. So it's important to protect these people, because a lot of times what happens is they end up getting terminated, they end up leaving because their work environments are considered to be hostile. So employers need to provide a little bit of protection for these people. And employers also have a responsibility towards investors. I mentioned before, proper financial management, insider trading. We don't want people to have access to information that isn't considered to be public knowledge, right? Martha Stewart went to jail for several years because she had access to information from someone who was on the inside. And she traded stocks of a company before they went down in value. Once again, you need to be making your decisions based upon information that's considered to be public knowledge. And also proper financial reporting. Companies do a lot of funny things. It's called creative accounting, where you can, take revenues maybe and put them on the books before they're actually collected, or all these different kind of crazy things that companies can do. It's important to engage in proper financial reporting because, like I said before, companies are going to use this information to make decisions off of. Well, not companies, but investors will. And if they're making the decisions based on inaccurate information, that will affect the accuracy of their decisions. Let's talk about implementing different types of social responsibility programs. Not everyone is on the same page in terms of if it's a business's job, if it's the private sector's job to really kind of push these types of programs. So people that disagree for it, people are for it. And let's go over some of the reasons for that, although they may be somewhat intuitive. So arguments against social responsibility, so to speak. The first of which is that it threatens profits. Remember, a business's primary objective, obviously, is the pursuit of profits, right? We talked about the concept or the definition of a business, being able to sell goods and services for a profit. It's these profits that a company can then either reinvest in its company, can hire workers, or can pay to investors as dividends. So profits are important. And so should we really trouble businesses with all these different social programs because there are so many different things that you can pursue and really support when a business's primary aim is to create profits, is to create jobs? So do we really want businesses involved in this? Some people don't think so. Also, if a business or if businesses in general get involved, they may have too much control, right? And we don't necessarily want that. At least some people don't. We don't want a business to be able to push a particular agenda if it's supporting a certain cause, so to speak. So this can be another reason for an argument against social responsibility. And then next, we have a lack of expertise. Businesses obviously are very successful in what they do, but maybe they lack the skill set necessary to push these different types of social responsibility programs. So do we really want to have companies that may not have the most experience in these areas to be pioneering and to be pushing forward these programs? Now, obviously, there are arguments for social responsibility. We have people that want businesses to contribute to social responsibility programs. The first of which is this idea that businesses should be held to a higher standard. They are essentially citizens of the particular country that they do business in. And so they should actually be a good citizen, right? And that should take precedent over profits. Providing for the economic stability and the social stability of a particular region should take precedent over profits in some people's opinions. Another argument for social responsibility programs, at least for business involvement, is that corporations actually have the resources to help. A lot of times government is not necessarily the best organization to help. As we all know, the government is in quite an interesting predicament because they don't have a lot of the same financial resources that they did before. A lot of local, state, and the federal government are heavily inundated with a lot of debt, and that inhibits their ability to do some of these other things like involvement with different programs in local outreach and such. And we're seeing with a lot of the state budget crisis, a lot of the local governments are cutting back, and that typically involves cutting some of these social programs so they don't have the resources necessary to actually continue to support them. And that's where, arguably, corporations come in. Corporations have some of the resources to devote to actually help some of these things. And then the last argument for social responsibility is that corporations should actually solve some of the problems that they create. Corporations, through pollution and all these different things that actually impact not only the environment but impact society at large, they should be involved in trying to figure out some type of remedy to eliminate the negative or harmful effects of whatever it is that they're doing. So that is also another argument for social responsibility. Now, there are several approaches that companies can take to social responsibility. And one of the things that I do want to highlight is that companies don't typically fall into one bucket or another entirely. Typically, some behaviors can fall in one end of the spectrum. So I do want you to keep that in your mind as we're going through these things, and as I give you examples for some of these approaches, is that a company typically won't fall entirely into one or the other. The first type of approach, though, is what's called an obstructionist stance. An obstructionist stance to social responsibility involves a company really doing as little as possible to promote social responsibility, to promote activity in society, and they really attempt to deny and even cover up violations that actually happen. Once again, doing as little as possible here is primarily what's going to. companies that fall into this particular approach here may often have little regard for their ethical or unethical conduct, for that matter, and they'll go to great lengths to actually cover up whatever it is that they're doing wrong, so to speak. So obviously, these types of companies are not necessarily positively impacting the society at large because they're typically trying to cover up things that they're actually doing. You may argue that some companies, maybe even Nike, for example, may take somewhat of an obstructionist stance with regards to working conditions overseas. That a lot of consumer advocacy groups approach Nike about furnishing the types of factories so that they can research them further and find out if they're getting fair wages, getting regular rest periods, working in good conditions that we otherwise experience here in the U.S. And so Nike has taken kind of an obstructionist stance with that regard. Now they have changed somewhat, especially as we begin to gravitate more towards consumer advocates and wanting for fairness no matter where people are working, no matter where on the globe that they're working, not just here in the U.S. but over in some of these other countries. So they have changed somewhat, but at one point in time they were very much taking the obstructionist stance with regards to those fair wages and working conditions. All right, next is what's known as a defensive stance. Okay, a defensive stance is not quite as maybe aggressive, so to speak, or on one end of the spectrum as an obstructionist stance is. But a defensive stance, the company will do everything that's really required of it by law, but they won't take anything beyond that. They won't go to any types of measures or do anything extra that will essentially try to solve some type of social problem or help or support some type of program. So these types of companies will admit their wrongdoings and obviously take corrective actions, but they won't do anything above that. A couple of the examples of these types of companies could be companies like tobacco companies, for example. They typically fit this description because they will do the bare minimum of what's required in the U.S. They won't advertise during children's television programming hours, but overseas, because there's no laws against it, they will. So they follow the law to the letter, but they won't do anything above that. They won't go beyond the call, so to speak, to do anything more than that. Companies that also fall into this category are a lot of manufacturing type companies that have facilities in multiple areas of the world. They will adhere to the local guidelines and the local laws and regulations with regards to what they can do, what they can pay, what the working conditions are, and those types of things, but they won't go above and beyond. They won't necessarily do more than is required of them because it isn't really required of them, for that matter. So they don't feel like they have an obligation to do anything more than that than to strictly abide by the law. Which, one thing that I always try to mention is just because something is legal does not necessarily mean that it's okay. So the law will cover things that are considered to be society having a general consensus that it is wrong. But as we've seen recently, the law has been written and it sometimes is very outdated, right? Technology has increased very dramatically in the last 10 to 15 years. And so we're seeing that a lot of the laws that were in place aren't applicable to the environment that we're in today. A lot of the rules and regulations that are being written today are for the internet, which has been around for a while. But there really was nothing in place to regulate the internet because it was new. When people created laws and different things years back, they didn't have the internet in mind when they were actually doing so. Those types of problems weren't prevalent as they are now. Next, a company can take an accommodative stance to social responsibility. Accommodative stance is a company that will meet its legal obligations, just like a defensive stance, but in some circumstances it may go a little bit further. Typically what this can look like is some companies, I know that Progressive Insurance, Shell Corporation, have a program in place where they will match your charitable contributions to different nonprofits. So if you say that I want to give such and such money to the Ronald McDonald House, and you kind of fill that out on the form that in HR, and they will match that particular payment, whatever that is. Now, the reason that's accommodative is that the company isn't doing that on their own. They're not proactively going and making that a priority. But if you come to them with saying that you want to donate money, they will match it. So they will accommodate you, but they're not going on their own essentially and being proactive. A lot of companies fall into the accommodative stance. They don't necessarily try and seek out social injustices and different opportunities that they can seek to remedy. But if they're approached by different groups, then they may be inclined to assist them, so to speak. And the next is the proactive stance. Proactive stance is all the way on the right end of the spectrum there. It's the most significant approach to social responsibility in terms of being just actively involved. In a proactive approach, the company actively tries to contribute to the well-being of groups and individuals. These types of companies may try to start different foundations. It's very common. A foundation that most people are familiar with is the Ronald McDonald Foundation, which is designed and locates typically close to hospitals so that parents with children in the hospital have a relatively inexpensive place to stay during that hospital stay. So it's designed to reduce the economic impact associated with having to live in a hotel, which can be very expensive, especially if it's for a long period of time. So that is an example of a company that takes a proactive stance. Now, as I mentioned before, companies can fall into multiple different categories, right? So on one end, very proactive, the Ronald McDonald Foundation, which is a part of, obviously, McDonald's, or something that was started by McDonald's, is very proactive. But McDonald's hasn't always been proactive with regards to its approach to social responsibility, right? It came under a lot of fire for the types of food that they use, right? They were basically blamed for obesity in America and not properly disclosing of nutrition values and not offering the types of foods that are nutritious and would, help people be healthy, so to speak. And so you're seeing a transition from that. Obviously, McDonald's has changed their food offerings in response to the criticism that they've been getting. And so you're seeing much more healthier offerings. You're seeing salads. You're seeing parfaits. Children's Happy Meals was a big point of contention before. Now it's not necessarily fries and a cheeseburger or fries and chicken nuggets, but it's now apples and different things that are viewed as being more healthy. So like I said, companies can fall into multiple different things. Okay, they don't necessarily fall into one or the other, so to speak. British Petroleum, everybody's familiar with BP. They obviously weren't very proactive, I would say, because some of the issues that led to the explosion on the Horizon tanker, or the Horizon actual oil rig, were things that they were aware of. They knew that these problems existed, but they didn't actually do anything about it. So maybe they took an obstructionist stance with that regard because they didn't follow the letter of the law, what they were required to do, so to speak. They knew the problem was there, but didn't do anything about it. And as a result, a lot of people lost their lives, and that area of the region was significantly impacted, especially economically, when a large portion of their revenue and everything, and a lot of portion of people's incomes is derived from being able to fish in those waters, which, as we all know, was very much contaminated after that particular point. All right, we're going to end with this slide here. We're going to talk about managing social responsibility programs. There are different things that you can do to start some type of social responsibility program in your particular company, but these are a series of steps that you can implement that will help you do that. The first thing, and probably the most important one, is it has to start from the top. It has to be a part of strategic planning. If it isn't important to someone high up in the organization, no one's going to care about it. Remember what I said before, is that we tend to want to emphasize things that are important to our managers. So if it isn't a priority to someone at the top, it's not going to be a priority to anyone else. The next is that top managers must plan for the level of management support. There has to be some type of discussion early on what type of funding, what type of time commitment are we going to allow for this particular effort, so that we know ultimately When is that cutoff point, so to speak? How much are we contributing? This also serves as a way to evaluate the effectiveness after all, at the end. If we committed to giving $10 million towards a certain project over the course of 5 years, and then come to the end of the 5 years, realize we only gave 2, then maybe that will serve for us to make a decision as to whether or not that program was successful and if we need to make any changes to it. Next, and this is also important, is that one executive needs to be in charge of the agenda for social responsibility programs. This is very important because at the end of the day, if not one person is accountable, then no one is going to care. Everyone's going to kind of stand back, and it's not going to fall on anyone's lap, so to speak. So there has to be someone in charge who's not only spearheading the project, but is also accountable for the results, either for the successes or for the failures. And lastly, the organization needs to conduct periodic social audits. A social audit is essentially like in accounting terms where you conduct an audit. You're basically looking at something and determining if it went according to plan. Did we use all of the resources that we said we would? Did we get the results that we thought we would get or that we hoped we would achieve? So those are the questions, looking at it objectively, not for the point of necessarily pointing fingers and firing people, but from the point of getting better, right? It's all about a process. And if you can analyze things objectively, looking back and understand, you know what, we did a certain thing, and maybe this wasn't the right way to go about it. Maybe we targeted a group that wasn't necessarily interested in what we were doing. And then you can change things going forward, ultimately to make your program more impactful and more successful in the future. All right, well, thank you very much for listening. I try to break these up a little bit between a 30 and a 45-minute lecture, so I do appreciate that. Any questions, please obviously let me know. Thank you very much. Bye-bye now.
Yeah.